Today we're going to tie a modified version of Landon Mayer's Jigged mini leech pattern, and it's modified in that we use a couple of different materials and we add legs to it. We're tying this pattern today for use in warm water as well as cold water for trout, and the action of the legs seems to help attract warm water species. So we're tying this today in a size 14, and I'm using an Umpqua size 14 60-degree jig hook with an 1/8 inch fluorescent pink bead. Of course, any color combination that you choose is fine. And we start our thread behind the bead, and I'm using white UTC 140 denier today, though 70 denier is certainly strong enough for this fly. And we wrap back to the bend of the hook and back up to our tie-in point and trim off our tag end. Now, the body of this fly is made with medium silver holographic tinsel. You certainly don't have to use holographic tinsel for your body, but any shiny material that will make for a little bit of flash in the underbody will work just fine. So we tie the tinsel in just behind the bead, wrap back to about the hook bend, and then bring our thread back forward. I'm going to use the rotary function on my vise today to quickly wrap this tinsel forward with close overlapping wraps. And as we get to the bead, we secure our tinsel with a few wraps of our tying thread and trim off the tag. The tail of this fly is made with micro rabbit strips. Landon Mayer uses micro pine squirrel strips in his mini leech and in his jigged mini leech, but we're tying it in white today. And white pine squirrel strips are difficult, if not impossible, to find. So we're using micro rabbit strips, which are cut a bit more narrow than the regular rabbit strips are. So to prepare our rabbit strip, we want to strip off the fur from about the front eighth of an inch of our strip. Now this strip is quite a bit thicker and wider than the pine squirrel that's typically used for this fly, so we want to trim that leather base to a point. Now, since this is a jigged fly and will actually ride hook up like this, we tie it with the fur pointing downward, and I put the point of the rabbit strip just behind the bead, and we tie it in over a space of about 1/8 of an inch or so. Now, as far as the length of the tail goes, it needs to be trimmed, and we want to trim it about 1 inch long, measured with the leather, not with the fur, which is swept backwards. So roughly 1 inch, trim in, slip your scissors in just under the skin and give it a trim. And as you can see, this with the swept back fur, the tail is quite a bit longer than the inch that we measured. Now, one more modification to this fly is the addition of rubber legs. So for rubber legs, I'm using crazy legs in pearl and flake today. And these work well for this small fly because they're relatively small in diameter. It just takes one strand of the legs. I'll trim it in half roughly. And then at the halfway point, I wrap my legs under the hook, but in front of the thread. This makes it easier to tie in. I give it a couple of loops, and then I can stretch these thin along each side of the hook shank, which doesn't build much bulk up behind the head of my fly. Now, these should be trimmed roughly even with the leather part of the tail. So we just bring them all up and give them all a quick snip together, and that's close. Now, the collar on this fly, like the standard mini leech, is made with ostrich herl. So after stripping the herl from the feather, or the plume as it's called sometime, I trim that stripped end off, and I am not going to strip down to the bare feather stem here because ostrich herl is quite slick, And if you strip that off, those feathers off, it can very easily slip out from under our thread, which we don't want it to happen. So we tie it in right in front of the leather strip, and then move our thread up to the bead, and we take 8 or 10 wraps of this to form a nice collar all the way up to the bead. And since I stretched those rubber legs, they didn't add a lot of bulk, so we still have a nice trim head to our fly. And so we tie our herl off with a couple of wraps behind, and then a couple of wraps in front. Give it a quick trim, and grab our whip finisher and give it a quick whip finish, and our fly is finished. And that is our modified version of Landon Mayer's Jigged Mini Leech.